Hey, folks, welcome back to The Pulse. My name is Matt. This is Crypto Heartbeat, and it is Stephen Friday. It is March 1st. Can you believe it's March 1st already? Wow. Well, this is a leap year, and we had leap day yesterday, and boy, things leapt. They literally leapt. The crypto market basically just went bananas. And I think we've seen over the last 7 days a 20% increase in, 20% increase in Bitcoin. And just interesting. Recently in the last 24 hours, we had like a massive, I think Coinbase had a $1 billion withdrawal. That's crazy. It's crazy. But it is Stephen Friday, and today is episode 42 of Right Side Up with Steve Staggs, right? In honor of Steve Staggs. And, I decided to continue this, and much to, encouragement of many people, to just continue to have these discussions. And what I'm doing is literally taking something topically from the 74 hours of content and then bringing a guest on. And so today's guest is Carter Hill. Carter is like longtime friend and kind of, he sat at the feet of Steve like I did, but he did it for like 8 years. So incredible. And so you get to get a perspective from Carter. He'll be coming in later. And then we'll go through some of this content. But today's topic is why evil exists. And we don't directly answer that question, but the whole point of what we're going to be talking about today, which comes from episode 1, and it's linked in the description, is this concept. And it was really the introduction. And so I go back to the beginning with Steve. And if you want to back up, we're going to be starting at minute 38 from episode 1. But we did 38 minutes of his pro baseball career and all this stuff. But it seems like every time I review this content, it's just fresh and there's some new insight. And of course, that's the truth of, the Spirit of God and Jesus working in this way to help grow us. And so it's just such an encouragement to me. And to me, this is going to be fun. And hopefully it'll be something that encourages you. But we've got some great people here in the chat. And of course, Mike Austell. Greetings, my friend. How awesome. It's so good to have you in the chat. Got my boogie shoes laced up. Rock on, brother Matt. Thanks so much. I'm glad that you're upbeat. It was so great to talk with you and Dan. It's just cool. It's amazing to me how God uses relationships and connections. It's amazing. You don't realize the impact that Steve has had and, doing this content and how it's impacted so many people. And, I just see that as the supernatural power of God in the world. Greetings to all my faithful RSU buddies. It's so cool. KDM, hello. What's up, KDM? Talk about guys that had relationships with Steve, right? KDM and Mike in special ways. It's just amazing. When I first met Steve, I was like, literally, I was like in my man up, like, is he an angel? And it's amazing to see the impact. Went to the service when the family had the services for Steve, and it's just amazing to hear the stories of how disciplined Steve was, but also what does a life look like, and what do you look like when you literally walk each moment out with Jesus, like literally in the moment, listening, doing. Well, the result of that is what we saw in Steve. He was very disciplined. And what was the character of it? The nature and character of it was patience and peace. And I'll tell you, I don't think I've met anyone more patient than Steve Staggs. So, Katie, I'm good to see you, buddy. And there he is, Dan McMillan, early bird gets the worm. Thanks for being here, Dan. It was great to meet you on Zoom and put a name with a face and everything. And I'm just glad you're back here. For episode 42, David Lee, without fail, David Lee's here. Hey fam, I'll be listening when I can. I have an appointment coming up. Totally understand, my friend. Thanks for being in here and saying hello. And then Sam Kemp. What's up, Sam? Another friend of Mike. Just amazing, these connections in 3 different states. We've got Texas represented and Florida, and I think we've got Massachusetts or something like that. So great to have you here. Bearded Saint, what's up, buddy? It's so good to see you. Hopefully the beard is back. DCRs from the Netherlands, having people across the world joining us is fantastic. Casey Hex, what's up? Afternoon all. Happy to catch a live stream. Thanks for being here. This is Right Side Up, and we've been doing this now for 42 episodes on Fridays at 11 Central Time. Crypto Compassion, what's going on? Hello, Apple from the Philippines. Thank you for checking in. Daniel, good to see you. DGen Hexagon. Drix. What's up, Drix, man? Oh, it's Cape Cod. Sorry. Cape Cod. Dan, thanks for being here. And Drix, always good to have you, man. So let me kind of share with you an introduction to this topic, and then we're gonna bring Carter in and have a discussion, and we're gonna dive into this content. It's amazing. Every time I go back through these recordings, I have to be reminded, because what you're going to find in this is that Steve often would introduce things, and he would say, we've been taught to think a certain way. And of course, if you've watched this content for very long, you know that the way a man thinks, right? This thing, the hearts and minds of people, and we see this in our everyday upside down world culture, that people, if they can control the way that you think, they can control you. And you think about this idea of your mind, renewing your mind. And of course, that's obviously, we know that that's important. But what are we setting our mind upon? And what are we focusing upon? And this idea that without Jesus, we can do nothing. I can do nothing. That, it's funny that so many of the people that I kind of know that have been kind of brought up or raised in the church and been trained a certain way, all of these things, they say, yes, brother, that's true. But if you really think about it, and that's what Steve did for me, if you actually think about what you're saying that you believe, it points you in this direction of an amazing journey. And I think that that's the thing I respect so much, because I talked about that a lot of what Steve shared with me. It's not like it was, he was teaching me some other religious thing, right? It was like, let's take this thing. And I guess the real point is, I'm going to take something that's upside down and we're going to turn it right side up. But there was also for me a focusing concept, right? It was almost like it was a click off. And, the more and more I realized that what is the goal of the spirit of darkness, right? What are these spirits trying to do? It's essentially presenting you with lookalikes. And we talked about that a lot on Right Side Up, is that we have to be able to discern between lookalikes. And so this idea that I think a lot of times we assume that we're alone in this journey, right? Well, what Steve really, just blew my mind with is, hold on, this Jesus is alive and he speaks. And if without him we can do nothing, then we can walk with him. Well, what does he provide us with if not discernment, right? This idea that we would be able to distinguish between lookalikes. And that's a big part of this, right? This idea of who are we giving our authority to, and what does this look like? But the beauty of it is in its simplicity, because once you get it, it's like, oh, so I don't have to do all this heavy lifting. Your yoke is easy and your burden's light. And that to me is super, super encouraging. But folks, before we get started with Steve, let's bring in Carter Hill. Carter is the guy who brought Steve and introduced him to me. So I have a lot of appreciation for Carter. Welcome to Right Side Up in honor of Steve Staggs and Crypto Heartbeat, the Carter Hill. What's up, buddy?
Hey, what's up?
How are you?
I'm doing good. I have my
You look
Steve
good.
shirt on and my Steve painting. And how are you doing, man?
I'm good, man. So Steve loved the color. He didn't want anybody wearing black at the service and any of that. But that picture behind you, tell us about that, because his son painted that. Is that right?
His son painted that and gave it to him as a birthday gift years ago. And I always knew that Todd was an artist. I was thinking corporate art, and I kind of follow him, watch his comic books. And but that painting's really important to me. The first time I walked into Steve's home, there's an Italian mural, and it looks like it just came straight out of Italy.
Wow.
And I was like, where did you get that, Steve? And he goes, my son painted that. I was like, are you kidding? I mean, it is the most amazing stuff you've ever seen. And he took me into his room and he showed me this painting, which is an abstract where his son always wanted to get him a yellow Porsche.
Wow.
But before that, I didn't know about this painting, and I said, and I knew he liked yellow, and I knew he liked Porsches. I said, someday we're going to get you a yellow Porsche, Steve. And I saw that painting. I'm like, oh, it's amazing to me. And the day after Steve was remobilized to be an Elohim in the heavenlies instead of an Elohim on earth, I said, Lord, I would really love to have that painting because I want to put it in the foyer of day 7 someday, because that's what Steve and I were working on, day 7. And then I thought about it. I'm like, I'm never going to ask for a painting.
Right.
And I dismissed it. Well, I never thought about it again until a week later, 7 days later. Todd gets on Instagram and says, hey, Carter, I was speaking with Dad today. And he said, if you would like to have that painting I made for him, he would sure love for you to have it.
Wow.
And during this time, I've been going, man, I can kind of hear Steve's voice still. What does that mean, Jesus? I could hear Jesus' voice and Steve's voice, and I could hear the words, but they were in unison. And that's where Jesus said, hey, all of heaven is in unison. We are not divided. We speak with one voice because we are the same. We have the same spirit. And I'll tell you what, it was amazing. I don't understand that. I know it causes a lot of people theological problems, but everything Steve and I know for yourself, there was a lot of theological problems that we bump up against. But that painting, every time I see it, it's amazing to me. It's so special. And Todd, thank you for that. Jesus speaks, man. And he hasn't gone anywhere. And what I asked the Lord, I said, well, what's he doing? And he said, he's doing the same thing and the same task I had him on earth. I just needed to move him to the heavenlies.
Wow. Wow.
And so I'm like, okay, you're still teaching Jesus with Steve.
Yeah. It's wonderful. It is. Yeah. And that's a big part of the mystery that you can ask, and you're doing that. Let me ask you this. So, you did what I was doing with Steve, but you did it like for 8 years or more. What was your introduction to him, and what was that what was that process like for you? Because out of anyone I know that kind of was essentially in this kind of discipleship, is kind of, I guess, what they would call in the Christianese terminology, but you walked out life with him for 8 years. What was that like, and how'd you meet?
Well, Jesus has had me working on things, and I've always wanted truth, man. That's all I've cared about. So I was raised in church, unlike you. We went Sunday morning, Sunday evening, hours on end, Wednesday night youth group, Friday, Saturday, something with the youth group. And I was kicked out of more youth groups and churches because of the questions that Steve, through Jesus, was able to answer for me. Because every time I would learn it and then I would go preach it. I would learn it and I would go preach. Oh man, and Jesus would show me it wasn't him. Hellfire and brimstone. No, that wasn't him. Love. Oh, that isn't him. But my heart's desire, and that's why you say we can be sincere within that religious system, but we can still be sincerely wrong. And that's why Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They've been deceived. Right. And so I've been working on a project that Jesus' vision is not a project, called Day 7. And throughout the years, I've been working on that, and I talked to religious people. And I'll give you an example. In Louisville, Kentucky, we had, before there was a Facebook, Jesus was having us build something for teens where you could post pictures of your life and comment. And the religious mindset, we met with everyone throughout Louisville, Kentucky, very wealthy people. And they said, no one's going to ever post pictures and comment online. That will never happen. And long story short, they went ahead and invested $15 million in gathering cell phone numbers and sending out a verse of the day from the Bible.
Yeah. And that's typical.
Okay. And so you fast forward 10 years ago. That was 20 years ago, by the way. 10 years ago, 3 years prior to meeting Steve, was working on the same thing. Hey, pedophilia is coming. Hey, everything that we're seeing today, I was saying 10 years ago, we've got to build this thing. No, that's silly. You're overreacting. You're a conspiracy theorist. And that was from the religious mindset because I kept reaching out to Christians. And I spoke with pastors over the years and I had all these questions, Matt. And then Diana Mullaney, her husband was friends with Steve. She didn't even know Steve. And Jesus said, hey, you need to share what Carter's doing with Steve Staggs.
Okay.
He didn't even tell me. She sent an email and he goes, the first question he said, is he interested in learning new ideas? And she goes, well, yeah, he just wants the truth. And so the very first email, he had reviewed the day 7 things I was working on. He goes, I see God's thumbprint all over it, but there is an intrusion. And we've heard that before. There's an insertion. And so that's how we met. And that was the introduction to Kingdom Companies. And then, man, Jesus saved my life because I finally got to the truth. I finally heard things that resonated inside of my spirit. I had all the Bible verses. I probably forgot more scripture than what most people will ever know. Because when I grew up, we went to Sunday school.
Yeah.
We did book reports on John visits the island of Patmos. I mean, we studied Hebrew and Greek, but we only had the paper big Strong's Concordance that you use for Bible Hub. We had all paper tools. There was no internet. And so I just thought that's where the answer was. And I just wanted to hear, but it wasn't until Steve that I learned to hear.
Well, and that, I know what my experience, spent tremendous amount of time on the phone, and I know you did as well, of all hours of the night. One of the things I always comment about is his nature and character, right? And I think about what's the result of someone since 1979, literally minute by minute walking with Jesus. And what is that? What do you look like after that, right? Like what is the impact on your person? And I'll be honest with you, when I saw him interacting with you, when I saw him interacting with others, when I saw him on screen, when I would visit with him in person, there was just a peace and a patience that I had a hard time putting my thumb on. How would you describe it?
Well, I can't remember which episode. Or no, it was Todd during the memorial. He said, my dad does not have a panic button.
Yeah.
Steve never did one thing, and he didn't say one thing without asking Jesus.
That's so awesome.
He never did.
Yeah.
He was so special to me, and I don't know why. Everything is silenced, and Apple thinks that we still need to have alarms. But he didn't have a panic button.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, things that Steve would say, you didn't make sense at first because we don't have the context for that.
Yeah.
Why would you do it that way? Where it was dealing with a problem at BMW where they absolutely had screwed him over on that BMW. They broke his transmission, then wanted to sell him a $12,000. I was there with him, watching him do business, and it is so counterintuitive to my nature and how we handle things.
Yeah.
But I would watch him, and it was when you guys started mentioning, he would look up, and you could see it in the episodes, and I got to see it in real life. It was a beautiful thing. And he did not say or speak anything other than what Jesus said and spoke.
Yeah.
It was calming. It was assured. And even though sometimes I wanted him to give me the answer, can you just give me the answer, Steve?
Yeah.
And see, and in the beginning, it was pretty rough.
Yeah.
And it looked something like this. Oh, F this, Steve. Are you telling me that the Bible is not the authoritative word of God? And he goes, did I say that, Carter? And he was so calm. He was so patient with me. I tend to have a charismatic personality, but Steve, for hours on end, I wrote this down because Jesus pointed this out, and it's good for you and I both. After he passed away, Jesus said, look at how much I prepared you. And Steve was saying, even the week prior, you're prepared. The vision is in your DNA.
Huh.
But I still have a lot of insecurities, Matt. I do.
Yeah, well, we all do.
And he took me through this thing where he goes, Steve spent 17, Steve would say, we spent 17,000 hours. I'm like, what does that mean? Nothing. Did you just have me? Well, that's about 6.5 hours a day for 7 years. And 7 days from the day we met is when Steve departed. Isn't that weird? Working on day 7.
Yeah.
That's pretty weird. But then throughout the days, he would show me other things like, hey, wait, when he spent that time in the morning with Jesus, and Jesus told him what to do that day, Jesus told him to spend that 6.5 hours a day with me for 7 years. Jesus told him to spend that time with you, Matt. And what you guys have produced it's eternal riches, what Steve would call eternal riches. These videos are eternal riches. I was reviewing the video earlier today. You said start at 38, minute 38. And it's new every time.
I know, isn't it?
And he knew he needed to spend this time with you, Matt.
Yeah.
He needed this to be done because it brings life to people once they hear it.
Well, what a great, you just teed this up so perfectly. Let's watch that segment, folks, and then Carter and I'll come back and we'll have commentary about that. But Carter, thanks for being on here, and we'll see you in a minute. But in the meantime, let's hear from the man himself. Official in the sense that it's a joy.
Yeah.
And so I want to start here. We're going to get into the meat and potatoes here. And I'm going to ask Steve a bunch of questions, and I really want you to listen to him, because what he's saying, I'll condense at the end and we'll put a kind of bow on this thing, but I want you to listen really carefully, because this stuff is really, it's really helped me. It's almost like get things into better focus. It's to see a new facet of this gem, and to recognize that, hold on a second, I've been believing a lie. And it goes back to the very beginning of all of this. So I want to touch on two things. The first thing I want to share, and let me stop sharing my screen here. So I want to share with you guys, we'll start with Matthew 4:4. And this is one of the things, I think the first thing for me when we had our conversation that really, really challenged my thinking. And I want to really examine all the edges of this one with you. So let me present this screen. So folks, this is, and you've probably heard this story before. Jesus is in the wilderness, right? He comes out of the wilderness. Let's just take a look at this. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, so here's Jesus, he's hungry. He says, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. And what is Jesus' answer to this? And this is one of 3 temptations. Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God. See, when you shared this with me, and of course, everything seems to have built on top of this concept of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Can you kind of talk about the significance of that and just your thoughts there? And then I want to go back to the garden. So I'll just tee you up with that.
Sure. I'll probably set a little bit of the stage for this in talking about how we are taught to think.
Yep.
Because from the time we were born, we don't end up on the planet with a PhD. Unless pooping diapers qualifies for that, right? But we come in as a blank slate, and then we are trained in a particular way. And one of the ways we are trained is in how to think. What's fascinating about how we are trained to think, we are trained to think independently while referring to others for our source. So if you see articles written, technical papers written or things, what do they have? They always have identifying, what the source of that comment is.
Yep.
So we are always taught how to refer to others on a horizontal level. But if you think about listening to Jesus, all of a sudden that's really weird.
Yeah.
How is it that it's okay to listen horizontally, but the idea of listening vertically, all of a sudden that's very weird? Or if you say I'm listening to what God is saying, what you're taught to refer to most of the time is referring to the Bible. So it's still, you're referring to a document.
Yeah.
And the document is what's telling you what God is saying. Well, that isn't what Jesus said at all. When he responded to the devil, he made it very clear that man lives on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And what's interesting about that, he gives you kind of a double whammy of what he's saying, because he uses a word the English word is actually the word rhema in the Greek, which is a spoken word. It's the word that produces statements. It's the word that produces commands. It's the word that produces instruction. And then he says, out of the mouth of God. Well, how is it that we are speaking? When words come out of our mouth, how does that happen? See, when words come out of our mouth, we're talking with one another. So what Jesus is talking about there is that this is how we are designed to work and to function. We are designed to function. Yeah, bread, food takes care of the physical body. That is the machine that we've been given to carry out our mission and mandate on the planet. But then how is that actually accomplished? It's accomplished through this dialogue of conversation that happens between us and God. And it's out of that dialogue that man begins to live and express his life as it was designed before time began. And that's what this is talking about.
Well, what's amazing to me, and this is, we're kind of starting with the end in mind, right? And so we literally start with this idea that, hold on a second, Jesus himself, when tempted by the adversary in this case, who had this power over the world, right? That had this ability to give him, authority or give him these things. He rejects it and he says, no, man does not live. He corrects him and says, no. And so I think what's really fascinating about this is this sets the stage for something I think is mind numbing to me. So for the last 23 years, folks, I don't know if you know this, but I've studied the Bible. I was transformed, had weight lifted off my back, and I saw that, hold on a second, just like Steve's saying, he's like, hey, I'm going to follow this guy. Well, ever since I decided I'm going to listen to Jesus, I start getting, there's implications to it. And the implications are extremely profound. And it really changed a lot of the nature. It's like he gave us a new name. And we literally were like, hold on, I've got different thoughts, different ideas, different direction. And I think differently, right? So there's this new creation that's created. And so I'm starving for understanding who he is, right? Well, one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, and I want to go back to, because I want to say, hey, Jesus is saying, man does not live on bread alone, but out of every word that comes from the mouth of God. Okay, the spiritual, the physical. Now let's go back to the original, beginning, right? And I want you to kind of speak to this, because you asked me this question and it like broke my brain. You said to me, did God know that the serpent was in the garden? And of course, we'll talk about that story. This just literally took my head and went, broke it open. Because that's a tough one to challenge with. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. The bridge that I'll build between the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness and the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden, the bridge between them is what I'll call strategic intent.
Okay.
Once again, we're taught to think more from an event orientation standpoint. We think in terms of events. So we look at the Bible, for example, from in terms of an event. So the event of Jesus being tempted by the devil, and this is what Jesus is doing, and we come up with all kinds of conclusions about what that exchange was all about. But it's all from an event orientation standpoint. It's not from a strategic standpoint. Okay, it says that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. So Jesus was sent there by design. Okay, Father, what was your strategic intention in leading Jesus into the wilderness? Okay, Jesus, when you were engaged with the devil, what was the authority that the devil was granted in that exchange? And then Jesus, how did you deal with the devil strategically? What was it that was going on there from a strategic standpoint that gave meaning to the exchange? Okay, mm-hmm. So take that same concept and put it into the garden. So when Matt and I were talking, as you'll recall, we have a certain way that we've been taught that happened in the garden. And it's almost like this whole thing happened because man was dastardly. And so he set out to disrupt God's plan. Well, we call it the fall.
Yep.
Well, okay, let's ask a question in this. Man lives by every word that proceeds. Jesus, what was going on there? Did this catch you off guard? And so what he did is he pointed me to, and you'll remember this, he pointed me to the angels who were set outside with their flaming swords, remember?
Yep.
And he focused my attention right on that. And you know what question came to my mind? Well, if you could put angels with flaming swords after Adam and Eve did their deed to expel them and to keep them from entering the garden, why couldn't you have done that before the event happened to keep the devil, keep Satan out of infiltrating through the serpent, kept the serpent out? Why couldn't you do it then? Good question, Steve.
So let me stop you there. Folks, for those of you that are listening and you've got ears to hear this, this is really, really big and important for me because this was a profound question. And I want to just restate it in a different way. We accept that God is omniscient, omnipresent. He knows all things. He's infinite intelligence. He's outside of space and time, right? Those of us who believe are like, okay, there is one that created it all. We are inside of this. He's in it and outside of. He's everywhere. And we understand he has all power and all dominion and all authority over all things. And we confess that. And I think a lot of people, believers, would say, yes, he knows all. But when you ask this question, it's like, this question's always been there, but no one's really asked it. You have all of this power and all this knowledge and all of this understanding. You have this ability to keep them out with flaming swords and angels at the gate. Why did you do this? Why did you let that one in? And that's where I think this whole story sits. And it's one of these things, folks, if you've been in the church and you've kind of learned the churchy ways, this is going to wreck you because it's a question that it demands an answer, right? Why? Why would you do it this way? So keep going, Stephen.
So to us, again, in our event orientation training, the most important questions to us typically are what and how. What happened? How do we fix it? What's going on? How do we, what are the what and hows are what are most important to us. But the most important question to Jesus is why?
Yeah.
Because the why is what gives meaning and purpose to the what and hows. And it's that why that has to be insulated and cut off in order to keep us in this event orientation mindset. So now you go back to this. Well, okay, if you could keep man out of the garden, why couldn't you keep Satan out of the garden, who then used the serpent, the animal class serpent, the serving class serpent, to then execute his plan? And then the next thing that the Lord took me to, is through this questioning of why, the next thing he focused me on was his statement to Adam when he told him about not eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the definitions are much more profound than the translation allows, but because most people are familiar with the translation, it says, Jehovah spoke back and said, in the day you eat, you will surely die. Well, guess what? He didn't say, if you eat. There's no if element in that exchange. He said, in the day you eat, you will surely die. So when you look at that, it's like, wow, this thing was intended and planned out right from the beginning. Again, the why. Okay, Lord, then why did, if this was not an if, but an inevitable outcome, then what was the strategic importance of that exchange? And here was his answer. Up to that point in time, man only knew good. That's all he knew. But I created him to rule with me. And to rule, you must exercise choice. You must be able to discern between what is the right answer and what is the wrong answer, what is true and what is false. Okay? Up to that point, man only knew what was good. He did not know what was evil until he partook of the tree. And at that point, he understood both what was good and what was evil at that point.
And this course brings up thousands of questions, because I think the way that I understood things and heard as a kid about what is this story about, and I think a lot of people would say, you're just you chose unwisely, you are corrupt and broken, and almost this judgment of God. And what you're saying, which resonates so dramatically with everything then I read that follows this big question, is this idea that if in fact God knew that the serpent was in the garden, that his plan was that we would be like him. And so we hear in the beginning that the Elohim, or God in this plural sense, creates man in his image. And what is so amazing about this is this idea that, hold on, we're image bearers of him and being like him. When we hear what the serpent lied about, he said, surely he didn't say that. You will not die. But this idea that if you eat of this, you will have the knowledge of both good and evil. And what's amazing about that is we treat that, and I feel like I've learned in the church that that's this destructive force of corruption, and it's turned me into this this devil himself. And what this question that you're asking, and as I examine it, and I ask Jesus myself about this, what resonates with me is, hold on a second. And this is what I hear the Lord say to me all the time. I love you. You're my son. Trust me, and I'll show you. That's what I hear him say to me all the time.
Yeah.
And what's amazing about this is it like brings up all of these stories from the Bible. And it's like, hold on, every story that he told after that is basically a commentary on this one, which is, hold on a second. No, you're a son. Even in the midst of eating the pig's food, as you come back and hope that you can be a servant of mine, I run out to meet you. I put a robe on your shoulders and a ring on your finger, and I hug your neck. We kill the fattened calf, and we celebrate that my son who is dead is now alive. And what's amazing about that to me is that this idea that, well, hold on, there is a purpose for us, because there was a directive that God gave when he kicked us out. And can you speak to that? There's this, it's something that I feel like no one's talking about. It's very clearly defined in that story of the garden and of the quote unquote fall, that in a way is the purpose of why we're here on this planet, according to that story. So what do you say, and what do you think that God is saying about why we're actually here having a conversation on YouTube from that story of the garden? What are we here for?
Well, that if you look at the whole creation story, and um, the first thing I'll share is that, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to kind of back and forth to give some context here, for the answer, is that when near the end of the creative story, there is this little statement that says, and God completed his work, and all the hosts thereof. Okay, so God completed the creation of heaven and earth, and all the hosts thereof. And he looked at it and said it was good and very good. Okay. Well, what's interesting about that is, when most of us look at hosts, we think of that in terms of all the stuff, maybe,
Yep.
all the planetary things of that nature. And so it's a pretty majestic sounding word, but it has nothing to do with what the original word that it's translating is. That word, the word that is translated hosts, is actually the word for armies prepared for war. So it says, and God finished and completed the creation of all of his armies prepared for war.
Wow.
And so that seems to me is a pretty significant kind of thing. So God, before you rested on the seventh day, you made sure that you had built, created, positioned your army prepared for war from the very beginning.
Wow.
What kind of war were you actually looking for? See? What were you expecting to have happen? Now, this all goes into the concept of choice, by the way. See? So now let's go back and say, with the strategic thinking part of this. So, God, what was the strategic purpose for you building an army from the very beginning that not only was able to defend what you were building, but to enforce the decrees that you were issuing before time began? What was it that you were expecting? Okay, now let's go back to the creative part of man. So, and I don't know if you want to get into this at some point, you mentioned it earlier, but the words that we are used to reading is, in the beginning, God, singular, created the heavens and the earth. But the word God is not, that's an aberration. That's not what that says. The word is Elohim, and Elohim is plural.
Yeah.
So if we were to put the God word on top of that, it would actually read, in the chief beginning of time, order, and rank, the Elohim created, shaped, and formed his heavens and his earth. So there is this class of being, this plural class of being called Elohim, that actually engaged the process of creating. Okay, so why is that significant? Because when it came for the Elohim to create man, the Elohim, and this is the language, so anybody could go in there and look exactly what it says. And what it says is, and the Elohim said to the Elohim, Elohim, rule, subdue, multiply, etc., etc. So the Elohim called man Elohim. Well, what are Elohim? Well, the translators put the God tag on it. And I would submit to you that is a defensive tactic that we can get at another time. But the point is that man is now called Elohim as well. Well, okay, Jesus, what are Elohim in your domain? Well, Steve, they are my rulers. They're the ones who are called to rule with me. I have Elohim in heavens, I have Elohim in earth, and man is my Elohim on the earth. They are charged with ruling. Now, their choice, one cannot rule without choice. One must have the prerogative of choice in order to rule. And here is the first choice that my Elohim man must make, whether he will rule with me or whether he will rule on his own. Apart from me. Now we see the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yep. Good Lord. Dude, oh my gosh. Every single time I watch it, like literally every single time, there's something new. Oh my goodness. Carter, I mean, there's so much more there, but we just talked, I'm trying to do this topically, and there's just so much densely packed into this stuff.
It is.
But it impressed upon me literally when I just literally closed it out is these things are such big ideas. And, you obviously journeyed with Steve, and you talked about this a long time ago, but it was always constantly a commentary, because these are the big things that, these are the big rocks. Like, this is the stuff that if you don't understand this fundamentally, everything kind of is off its trajectory. And this is what is the result here but an upside down world? And so the two big things that I'd love your commentary about with that, and just anything that comes to mind, is, Steve always would introduce things with this idea of that you've been trained a certain way to think. And are you interested in thinking differently, right? And understanding that you come from a perspective and a worldview that's been influenced by a lot of different things. And you think you say, well, I know what the Bible says, but there's a lot there that when you say, I think I know what the Bible says, hold on a second. Have you asked those questions? And, one of the things he said in other commentaries, he said, are you going to trust the, what was written, or are you going to trust the author? And the other day, I was back in the on the mountain with Moses, right? And
Right.
Here he is creating, and literally talk about the original book. It was written on stone. And what was hilarious about it is the first ones got broken because pretty upset. Moses was pretty upset. And I thought about it, and I thought the perfect example or analogy here is if in fact God intended for the book to be the authority, then Moses should have taken the 10 commandments that were broken and he should have epoxied them back together. But what did he do? He went back to the author. I think what's so amazing about the story, I never had seen it that way before, is that it basically was a commentary upon the writings, that these are a derivative. I'm the author and the perfecter, and this is a derivative of me. I will write these things. But what we've done is we've elevated those above the author. And we go into this whole thing. The things I loved that he said was, we talk all the time horizontally. Why is it so out of the ordinary to think that we would talk vertically to God? And that it is so clearly, when you see it for what it is, it's like, no, I've shown you the way that we can do this together. And when you see that stuff knit together, you go, oh my goodness, all of these things are making sense. And it's really relevant right now because we're coming into an era, Carter, where we're seeing all these scientific people and people in Congress with disclosure. And what's amazing is this story of what's actually written there and what Steve talked about with the Elohim is actually what we're discovering to be true. And I'm just like, this is amazing. And that's what resonates, truth for me. But there's so much to talk about. What comes to mind when you watch that clip?
Well, prior to getting on, I went back and I go through, and Jesus led me. I was watching the first episode, and where I left off, it was really interesting because you told me we're going to start at minute 38. And I opened and signed into Google or into YouTube, and it had stopped at minute 38 is where I left off the other day. I'm like, okay, Jesus. And see, that's another way he speaks. Hey, are you paying attention? What are the odds of that?
Yeah.
You said it at first. There is so much, even when I was watching through that, to digest. It's not a small thing. And at everything you just said. I have to write notes. And so you have to forgive me. But I think one of the most significant things is the misdirection doesn't allow us to see ourselves as the Elohim rulers. See, Steve is now an Elohim ruler, and he had mentioned it in heaven.
Yeah.
We are the Elohim rulers on earth. When we look at all the stuff that's going on in the world today, one perspective that we get is people are really freaked out. But what did Jesus say? There's coming a day when I'm going to open the ears of the deaf and the eyes of the blind. And it becomes alarming. It's an alarm, right? What does an alarm do? Steve and I would talk about that. Well, and you guys did too. Well, that's all we're seeing. So when you have Jesus' perspective, then there's a couple of things that we've got to look at. One, every time something crazy happens in the world, I'm like, oh, Jesus, thank you. More eyes are being opened. It's a rejoicing for me now. I don't sit back and go, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Look at what Biden did. Look at the wars. Look at all this stuff. I've been following that since I was 12 years old. And I was fortunate that Jesus set that up for me to see ahead. But you had mentioned so many things. What's funny about the book is we're reading a book where everyone in the book heard the voice of Jesus. Except we're told by religion, just read the book. Well, hey, wait, if we did what they did, we would be hearing the voice of God.
Right.
The books are written afterwards. For most of that history, they didn't have a book. So Steve would always say, how did they do it? How was it done? It's only if we live by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, right? When he says that. You had mentioned Satan. Well, I come to learn, call it this, it's God's manufacturing process. See, if you have that misdirection that he was talking about, that Steve was talking about, then you don't see yourself in it. It's how religion has caused us to see it. But Satan must fulfill the will of the Father. And Steve always talks the story about when he's standing before Pilate. And that was another, all of these are super eye-opening that expands your entire world. And you go, oh, wow, because it has implications in all of our other thoughts. Well, hey, well, didn't the Father need Satan to, that was his admittance to go bring back that realm that Satan unlawfully took away over God's man. And so wasn't the plan for Jesus to die to gain access to that realm? Well, so Satan served the will of the Father. He didn't know it at the time, but he knew afterwards. Had he known, he would have not killed the Christ. And so when we go back into the garden, it's a beautiful thing. Hey, if you only know goodness, how are you prepared to rule and reign over wickedness?
Yeah.
It's just now, I haven't always agreed with that. God, couldn't you have done it a different way?
Yeah.
But no, in his wisdom, he did it the one perfect way. I will teach them how to rule and reign. It's a maturing process. Steve loved the show Game of Thrones. I loved it. I never watched it when it was on. I thought it was stupid. Jesus took me into watching it. I've watched it all the way through twice, but there's a part in it that says the boy must die so that the man can live. And the whole time, the guy that was the adopted servant bastard was the king's son. He was the rightful king. Do you know what you are, Matt? Do you know what we are? David, everyone watching, Steve, we are the rightful heirs and the royal sons, the Elohim, who are to rule and reign here, and we can only do it if we listen to our commander and king.
Yeah.
Isn't that a different perspective, Matt, on what happened in the garden? It changes everything.
Yeah. Well, there's in the upside down world, the misdirection is a false humility. In the church, there's this desire, you think about how do you keep your nose clean, kid, right? That's what my dad would put it. And what you don't realize is that if you look at it from this perspective, that, and this is what's so encapsulated in the story of the prodigal son, is that it is the story to me, like it is the encapsulating story of all of it, is that we go to our Father, right? And we want our inheritance now. And I look at the situation in the amazing wisdom of God. He finances the son's debauchery, right? He knows the son's going to take that and he's going to go out, but he needs to experience this, clumsy nature. He needs to go out and spend it all. He needs to find himself in this position because he will not understand his father's nature and character without going through this pain. And you think about that as a father of kids, you're like, I want to protect my kids from all kinds of things, but there's certain things you have to learn on your own. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing about this idea of ruling and reigning, and I had a hard time with this too when I first started with Steve, but you don't rule over things that are good.
That's right.
And you think about this, well, in order to rule, right, to have dominion, to subdue, you have to know which things to subdue. You need to know which things to rule over. And what's amazing to me is the big story of, why does evil exist? Well, it is, by contrast, a teacher. And if you think about this, in other episodes, you talked about how he gave the authority of naming rights to Adam to name the animals. And of course, prior to this, temptation, if you will, with the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they recognized that the serpent was the wisest and most clever of all of the creatures that the Lord God had created. So the Lord God created these animals in the servant class, And, I guess you could make a really good case that they spoke to, they were speaking animals at the
I
time.
think so.
Yeah, and it's pretty cool to think that, but they knew this. And so it wasn't, I think what's so dumbed it down in the church for just simplicity reasons is that the snake or is Satan. But in reality, the realm of the spiritual requires a host, right? Because they're not Elohim. They are literally this spiritual realm that has to enter through this host. And we see this all the time through the spirits entering through, wanting to go into the pigs. That's a whole other discussion. But the fact of the matter is that the Lord God knew that this was going to happen. And
He planned it to happen.
yeah, and intended it to. So
He
that
always proacts, right?
Yeah.
Matt?
This was strategic. Right. This was the plan. And it's hard to imagine that because it's not presented that way in our culture. And I believe that this is the deception, right? Because what it deceives you into thinking is that you're lower than the angels, right? But when you understand that his intent is that you would know the difference between good and evil, and you'd be able to exercise choice. And he said this, the quote from his, to rule, you have to exercise choice, but you can't exercise choice unless you know you can discern between lookalikes. And I think that's probably the greatest. It's the greatest like condensing of it, because what happens is when you realize that if God created us to rule and reign in his nature and character with him, if that's the purpose of his creating, then he is literally going to use this strategic function of the temptation of this eyes being open so that you can essentially, you were Elohim, but now you're going to know and I'm going to give you the opportunity to practice that in the world. Right. And what's amazing is you think about, there's no good story that we watch that doesn't have an adversary. And if you think about, if you see pure light, how do you know that it's light? And this idea that, well, what is darkness but the absence of light? And what creates the contrast? And so being able to understand the nature and character of our Father actually requires that we see the difference. It has to be up against something that has contrast. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing about this is, no wonder so many people feel lost. They feel like, is there, I read the book, I fumble around, they tell me that I'm broken and I'm corrupt and that I'm, and we failed God in all this. And no, that's not the story. This is actually the means by which you come to understand his nature and character. You are the prodigal son, and you end up at the end of yourself going, I've tried it my own way and this doesn't work out so good. What if I tried it your way, Father? And he's like, all right, my son was dead and now he's alive. And I think we've condensed that down into like, get saved, brother. And he's like, hold on, no, you don't realize you are. And if you think about this, what does it mean to be a son? Like just in a regular family, what does it mean? So we adopted a boy. My boy is adopted. It's the greatest thing that God has taught me. But I'm like, so you're not going anywhere. You are my son. You are adopted into my family. You are mine. And because he was afraid. He's like, well, are you going to send me somewhere else? And the most beautiful thing that comes out of that is to say, no, but, he's learning his own father's nature and character, right? Mm-hmm. And this idea that I tell him all the time, I'm like, dude, let's be buddies forever. Like, that's how we talk to each other. Let's be buddies forever. And I think about how much I love him. Yeah. And I think about, I want to do this. Let's experience this life. It's short. Let's do it together. Yes. And I see the same thing being communicated here. And it's like, everyone told me I couldn't talk to him. They said he was alive, but he doesn't speak. And I'm like, this is the most amazing thing ever. Is that what would it be like? And here's what I found. There's a direct relationship of not only peace and simplicity and ease, but amazing strategic doors opening when I literally stop trying to do it myself. Mm-hmm. I feel like I've muscled things for so long, Carter. I've been like, I'm going to do this thing and we're going to do this and I've got this plan. And it's almost like Jesus saying, oh, really? Oh,
You've
really?
experienced that too, huh, Matt?
Well, and that's the thing, and I think that that's what's really interesting is, I said on that last episode with Steve, 37, I said, he told me that it's not falling apart, it's falling in
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this. So I want it to happen now, Carter. I
Yeah,
want it to happen now. He's told me that it's gonna no. Well, why hasn't it happened? It's his timing. He's out front. He's the shepherd. We recognize his voice. We follow him. He provides. And I'm like, so I can rest in you? And I'm like, oh my gosh. Thank you, Lord. It's
Mhm.
just amazing, dude. And it's like, I'm really frustrated when it's not happening now. I
And
want it
yet it is.
now. I want it
It is
now.
happening. We
I
just
want it
have to see
now.
it. I do too. Well, you know what you're speaking about, and I know it's not the garden, but Stephen Root, a really good 40-year
Yes.
long
Yes.
friend.
I hope to
And
have him on on this one time. It would be awesome.
oh man, they have been such a blessing as you and Joe Cotton.
Mm-hmm.
But the word that Jesus had given Steve, even for me, as we went through Hebrews, and it was chapter 4. But it's resting. We move when he moves. We speak when he speaks. We do not one thing apart from him. And it talks about sin there. But if you replace sin without doing anything apart from him, that is where our rest
Yeah.
is listening to the shepherd's voice. And I want it now too. I've wanted it every day. I've wanted it, except I learned with Stephen over the last 7 years. I'll tell you what, there's when we were at the Gen Con, he said, well, what are you doing? What are you doing to support your family? What are you doing to make your car payment? What are you doing? I'm just like, I'm just doing what Jesus told me. And you're like, well, you just shrug your shoulders, right?
Yeah.
Well, me too. I wanted money beforehand. I still have none. But you know what? Would I replace the 7 years now that Steve's gone? What did Jesus need me to do?
Yeah.
He needed me to learn to hear his voice. It wasn't to make money at the time. It wasn't to build at the time. You've got to prepare the man so that he can operate with Jesus so we don't create something corrupt again.
Yeah.
But I want it now too. I'm with you, Matt. It's like,
amen to that, dude.
Now, I'll tell you what I've experienced since speaking with Stephen Root and the word that came through Jesus on resting in peace. And that is every morning I've really started to practice what Steve did, which I thought I was already doing, but Jesus will take you to a more granular level.
Isn't that the truth?
Right. And then it's like, no, I'm literally, your day is like this. And Joe and Stephen both live this way too, just like Steve did. What are we doing today, Jesus? Okay. And then I'll call who he tells me to call. I wanted to call you so many times, but Jesus says it's not time. Okay. I always have my agenda, and Jesus goes, here, we're going to go do this. And it's been beautiful. And at the end of the day, here's what I'm experiencing. How do we do today, Jesus? And I'm satisfied in my work with Jesus for the first time in my life. He's calming me down. That may not be apparent.
That's awesome.
But he's calming me down, and I'm satisfied with what we accomplish each day. Now that's ruling and reigning. There was a story as you were speaking that Steve went to it's his grandkids. I think it was graduation. Did he tell you about that story? And what had happened is that was during the pandemic and everyone was wearing masks. And he said, I'm not going to wear a mask. And even his children said, hey, can we put on the mask, Grandpa? Let's not rock the boat. But Jesus had told him specifically to not wear that mask. The long story short, a police officer was approaching him. And in the background, it was like a concentration camp. Please put on your mask. And the officer saw him without a mask, approached him. And I remember Steve saying, Jesus, what do you want me to do? And he simply said, stop. Are you sure you want to do that? That was it. The ruling was stop. The police officer, it appeared to Steve, no longer saw him, turned around and walked away.
Yeah.
No conflict. That's reigning. Stop.
Yeah.
We think it's like, oh, we're going to shout out demons, and in the religious sense, here, let's cast out something. And what we're doing, which kind of leads to prayer, is we're sitting around telling spiritual forces what to do without asking Jesus. In prayer, we're telling Jesus what he needs to do. And if we knew, then why don't you just go ahead and do it? And what I've learned, prayer is more of listening to Jesus. You can confer with Jesus. That's an interesting concept we can talk about sometime, and exchanging wishes. But it's really, here, I'm going to give you my perspective, quite honestly, that sucks. And I'm going to give it to you. And can I have your perspective? So my prayer is, can I just see it how you see it? I don't want to say a word that you would not have me say.
Yeah.
And when you get to that place, it changes everything.
Yeah.
It changes it all, because you're learning to rule and reign. And that's why he set the whole thing up.
Yeah.
See it that way. We started in a garden. He gave you a glimpse of how it's going to end.
Yeah.
Where we're entering into is, it looks so nasty, but we're entering into that new millennial age, I believe.
Yeah.
And
Well,
return as we learn to rule and reign with him.
yeah. Well, it starts in a garden and it finishes in a city. And it's interesting, that growth, right? When you look at, Revelation 21 and 22, it's in a city. And you think of the kingdom, right? And that's the whole point, is that what is the kingdom come? What is your will be done on earth as is in heaven?
It'll
But
look just like heaven.
Yeah. But a funny note, I just had to say this. So Steve's son mentioned, talked about him at the service. And I couldn't help but think about him, Todd, when you said he told him to stop, right?
Stop.
Remember Obi-Wan Kenobi when they were in Tatooine and the stormtroopers walking, and he literally just says, nothing to see here. And I'm like, that is totally what Steve did, right?
That was Steve, man.
Yeah, it's
Isn't that awesome? Not a panic button.
No.
How do we handle this? It is so important, because these questions really mean something. They're not just rote questions, but if you'll start asking them, they're really important. How do you see this, Jesus? How do you want to handle this, Jesus? But what is your perspective on this, Jesus? And what it is, acknowledging that I don't want to lean on my own understanding. That verse, lean on your own understanding, consult with Jesus, and he will make your path straight. We've used the word acknowledge.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a funny word. That's one of those misdirections. Oh, I acknowledge you. Now I'm going to go do it my way.
Yep.
Well, and what has it resulted? Name one thing in this world that's not corrupt. If religion was correct, then wouldn't the world look different? If we were truly the salt, wouldn't the world look different? And so now we're coming into a new age where we get to do it with Jesus. And he always wins. He's always pro-acting. Oftentimes we look and say, oh, look at what Satan's doing throughout the world. And Jesus is saying, what we should be doing is going, hey, wait, what did Jesus do to provoke that? Well, he's bringing the enemy into the theater of light to be dealt with. 2 Thessalonians 2:8. He's bringing the enemy into the theater of light to be dealt with once and for all. And when we go through hardships, when we go through things we don't understand, do we not know at the end of that, if we allow Jesus to work with us, we're like, oh, that's how you work, you little sneaky bastard. You don't get to do that anymore. You were just deemed inoperable. I am a ruler. I do not answer to you. You answer to me.
Well, and you know what? So, a lot of that language, and one of the things I think I'm relatively sensitive to is to those who didn't grow up in the church, and because there's a whole like vernacular and language that I feel like the church has taught people, and I think some of this stuff sounds kind of crazy sometimes, and I almost have one foot in each camp, and one of the things I think is really helpful is that I've seen the practical of this. And what you're talking about, and Steve mentioned this many times, but this idea that, in the garden and in many different places when Jesus himself was tempted, that essentially when you recognize that you are a son of God, right, that you are an Elohim man, that he made you to rule and reign in his nature and character with him, then you say, okay, I'm essentially this image bearer, and I'm an extension of you. And you have given me certain attributes that are fundamental to my class, right? You're the boss, right? And one of the things we'll go into at another time, I don't want to go into it now, is that Jesus as the Yahweh of the Elohim. And I think what is really incredible about that statement is, I'm really interested in disclosure. I'm really interested. And I feel like the Lord has said to me, there's a lot of people in the future when all this stuff comes into the light, because it's coming into the light, this disclosure is happening.
Yeah.
It's going to be such an ontological shock for them, and it's going to rattle so much of their understanding, especially the kind of the Christian folks, especially evangelical Christians, is that who's going to be able to make sense of this? And of course, Jesus can make sense of this, but there are people who have to articulate that. And one of the things that I feel like, Steve, it's very meaningful for my own personal journey, is that you're hearing more and more talk about, because everything's coming out into the light. There was a show on Netflix by Graham Hancock called Ancient Apocalypse, and a lot of people saw that. And he talked about, prior to the Ice Age, there was a different civilization, and all these stories are the same. And he really talks about, there was a global flood. Oh, imagine that! And every single civilization, and then there's tribes everywhere, and pretty much their stories are all the same. There were some people that came down and they gave us some stuff.
The Watchers.
Yeah, well, there's all stories of the Watchers, obviously, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of the Giants. There's the Nephilim, all that stuff. And then you go into Enoch, and it says literally Shimyaza, who is the leader of these, and they were Elohim. These were not angels. These were actually the sons of God. And it says in Genesis 6:12, it says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and took them as wives, and had offspring. And they were the Nephilim, the men of renown, the giants.
The giants.
And when you look back now, all of this research they're doing about, megalithic structures and all the things that would be considered, I think, pre-flood, is that we realize, hold on, all these stories that we've heard of about, Poseidon and Zeus, and then you go into the Egyptian side and you see all these other, godlike people. Then you look over into India and you see, the Vamana and, Balu creatures with 11 arms. And you see all of this stuff and you go, it's really interesting that, one of the first things God said was, you should have no other gods before me. And I think a lot of times we think of the idols that we build, but you're speaking into a group of people that understood that there were people with, there's Elohim, and there are Elohim besides you. And the idea that the Elohim said to the Elohim, well, guess what is coming out right now? And this is really shocking the scientific community, and it's not religious at all, is they're saying, you know what, a lot of this text that comes out of the cuneiform tablets that is that's pre Moses and Genesis is the same story. But guess what its story says? It says the Elohim created. And what's really amazing is we've taken that term and said it's God. And I think, for convenience sake and for distraction's sake, we're like, well, let's, we don't want to get into that. But when you actually get into that and you see that stuff revealed, you go, okay, I don't want to say that I know the answer, that there's genetic manipulation happening and that we were created for these purposes. But if you think about this, a son is a son is a son is a son. Here's the thing. Who you are, if those demons and those that were in the spirit of darkness were so damn tough, we would be gone by now. And why do they care so much? Well, there's so many stories in the scriptures about birthrights. There's so many stories about one grabbing another's heel. There's so many stories about this, who has the authority and who is a son and who's not a son and who has favor and who doesn't have favor. And of course, you've got, right now we're dealing with, and I think what we're seeing is these angels and demons. We're seeing this stuff that actually is non-Elohim, that desires, there's a jealousy of what we have in him, is that we have this Elohim status. And that, well, if we could just merge, if we could just be a part of it, then the Yahweh of the Elohim who created it all would actually acknowledge us. And what's amazing is my brother-in-law said this to me. He said, when you're in the military and someone, let's say one of your officers or one of your enlisted men gets out of line, do you kill them? What if they do something illegal in the service? No, do they kill them? I was like, no. So hang on a second. So what you do then For those that are in your care, that are officers or enlisted men, if you do something wrong, they don't kill you. No, they take you and they put you in the brig
That's right.
because of who you are. And what's really interesting about that is when you start drilling into the scriptures and understanding it from this perspective, then looking at these things, you're like, hold on, there's a story that's coming out of this that has been covered and it's been hidden that makes way more sense. And so when you do read things like the Book of Enoch, or then you actually look at separate materials from the Sumerian text, you go, okay, this makes way more sense. But then I'll finish with this. Steve, at the end of what we just looked at, said when he was creating for this army in preparation. You think, oh, why would I be prepping this army? Like, what are they fighting and all that? And it struck me, Carter. You know, when you are a kid and you enlist in the service, they're like, everyone's going to boot camp, Carter. Everybody goes to boot camp.
Right.
I don't care who you are, you're going to boot camp. And they basically tell you how to speak, how to walk, how to dress yourself, how to, right? Everyone has to go through this. And what's interesting is you said at the beginning of this that Steve is an Elohim in the heavenlies, right? There's work to do. When you look at it from that perspective, I look at this and I go, this is training. We are being trained for a purpose. There's a purpose here and there's a purpose after here. But the question is this: are you going to go your own way? Because I'll tell you, it leads to eating the slop of the pigs. Or are you going to recognize the nature and character of your Father? And are you going to then do it with him? And that ultimately, Carter, what you know and what I know is that if he said, my kingdom come, my will be done on earth as it is in heaven, the only way we're going to know what it's supposed to be like is his will, is to listen to him.
That's right.
And it's so, like, when it all like snaps together for you, you go, so you're saying that all I have to do is listen to you and that you're accessible. And what I think is so beautiful about Steve, and just love the person that God made him to be, and the patience that he had, was that he understood that it was all in God's timing, that he was strategic and out front, and that we didn't need to Steve didn't have to muscle it. He didn't have to insert himself, that the Lord was going to accomplish those things. And I'm just so happy that, you said, hey, there's something new happening with you, even since Steve has passed. And I think that's
amazing.
Brilliant. It's beautiful. It is so beautiful, because it's sad, right? Because you're like, I don't want Steve to be gone, right? I want to be able to talk to him on this. But here I get to talk to you and to see that Jesus is still continuing to work on you and through you. And it makes me so happy.
When Steve, you're the one who broke the news when Steve passed. And if you'll recall, I was horrified.
I do recall.
I was horrified. And yet in the midst of that horrified, what happened? Okay, hang on. I stopped almost immediately.
Yep.
Even though I was horrified, and it hurt like hell, man. But I was horrified, but I stopped immediately and go, hey, wait, no, there's a reason and purpose. What would Steve say?
Yeah.
See, that's part of training. Whoa, this whole horrible thing just happened. Unbelievable. My best friend, the wisest man I've ever heard on the planet, took me out of darkness. Jesus graced me, taught me how to teach him. I mean, talk to him every day for 7 years on average, and gone. Who else do I go to? Well, you know who else was sitting right there? Jesus.
Yeah. You don't need the crutch. And I think it's
huge.
Wheels
are off, buddy. You're in the game.
Yeah, you're in the game.
You're in the game. And what we fail to see in everything you just said, what we fail to see is who we really are, our true identity. Yes. We are rulers. If we could just see that, we are rulers. We are princes in the kingdom. We are the Elohim on this earth. I say it like this: your kingdom come where? We get to see Jesus focus on earth. Your will be done where? On earth. See, when you separate it, then it starts to narrow. Well, what was Jesus' focus? Oh, I can't wait to get to heaven.
Right.
Jesus is going, heaven's perfectly fine. My thing is, I'm teaching all 8 billion people how to rule and reign, bring you into the glory and who you really are. That is who we are, and we do it when we unite. It's all when we're in unison. Now that they are united, nothing will be impossible for them. We still, in some respect, view ourselves as the grasshoppers like the Israelites did.
Yeah.
Well, they got to wander around for 40 years. Why? Because they didn't believe what God said.
Right.
Go take the land. Well, that's too big. The giants, what do we have nowadays? We have tech giants.
Yeah.
The giants are too big. Go into the land. I said, what was there? Joshua and Caleb. Let's be Joshua's and Caleb's. Let's learn who we are. And that's my prayer is, man, Steve, are we going to ever get there? No. But you know what? Yes, you will, because it's all about perspective. Think about this, Matt. If we knew who we were, 100%. See, Satan has to use us for our authority because he doesn't have that authority. He's a user.
Yeah.
And he has to convince our mind, the Elohim man, when we war against each other, great, because he's got to get Elohim man to go destroy an Elohim man, because like you said earlier, he doesn't have that position. The demons and angels don't have that position. We do. They're jealous of they have to use us for our authority to carry out Satan's will. Well, when you're listening to Satan, it's really easy. And we think it's our own thoughts. That's where he resides, the malware. Steve and I used to call it malware. Well, that's just when we chose to listen to Satan instead of our daddy's voice. Let's listen to dad. He created it all. Jesus created it all. And so when we listen to him, guess whose kingdom we're building?
Yep.
On earth as it is in heaven. It's a beautiful thing, man.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And this is just, we wrestle through all kinds of things, but I just want to be honest about it is, when you face death, right? My own father and then Steve is probably the freshest here.
Mhm.
It does seem so final, right? It seems so final. And of course we have to remind ourselves that it's not final. And we talked about a lot of times that this isn't life, and that death is not, it's not judgment, it is reward.
It is
And
reward.
Steve knew that more than anyone. And if you think about this, look at the effort that God went to, right? Look at the effort. And I was doing a project with my son. He had a hard time with a essay project that he was supposed to do, and he did not do what he was supposed to do. And so his dad had to come to, into the scene, and we had to work on it together, right?
Right.
And what's amazing about that is the story was ultimately about the Last Supper. And he and I, he's 12 and, he's going to be 13. And we had this really interesting discussion because he had to write this thing. So I couldn't write it for him, but we talked so much about this. And what was amazing about that interaction with my own son in this is I think he understood, and we talked about, look at the lengths at which you are so specific with your people, right? You choose this people, you give them this tool and power, you give them this law. And what's amazing is you find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane asking the Father, hey, is there any other way we can do this? If there's another way, remove this cup from me. And Steve always would say it was likely something like, well, what we decided since the beginning of time that we would do, right? And you think about that love, right? To say, I'm going to pay for all of this, and we're going to make this thing right. And you think about this access that we now have. Why are we even doing this? Why does this even matter? Is because there's so many things that I feel like are barriers for people that I feel like the church or religious people or whatever have put in place to say, do I have to be weird like those people to like be interested in this Jesus guy? And I feel like there's a lot of that. That's how I felt for so long. I was like, these Jesus people are weird.
Well, it's weird.
Yeah. And I don't mean from a genuine weird. I don't mean from a Jesus standpoint. I don't think if you follow Jesus, you're just weird. I do think that there's some weird folks, but it's the language, right? And I always said Steve made me feel like Jesus was so much more accessible. And of course, you're saying the exact same thing. Are you interested Are you interested in? And I remember Kadium. Kadium's actually watching right now.
Interested.
Kadium and I sat in a hotel bar lounge in Austin, and he asked me this question. He said, "How do you know when you're actually hearing from him?" And I remember I asked Steve that exact thing. And what I love about this is he doesn't. You're not responsible for your education. You're responsible
Uh,
for your interest.
that's his job. That's his role.
That's his job. And what's so cool about this too is that, you know, we talk about the way in which Jesus speaks. And I feel like we have to be cautious. You know, I think some people are pretty frivolous with like, oh yeah, Jesus said this and Jesus said that.
Mhm.
You know, it is to me such a reverence for anything that's spoken. And that when I think about that direction is it's not just words, right? It is pictures, it is open doors, it is, you know, serendipitous things, it is people,
Thoughts,
it's
email.
thoughts, it's 38, it's the timestamp of 38, it's the yellow Porsche behind you, it's the colorful
right.
shirt. And you think about that and you're like, okay, well, how do I know it's true? And what I condense it all down to is it's a peace that transcends all understanding. Because you know what I realize? I'm
Mhm.
so tied up in the actions of, you know, conquering the hill that actually, if all heaven rejoices when the man is transferred, when he actually decides to do it with Jesus, right? And he's like, hey, not my will, your will. You're the only one who has authority to speak to me. No one else has authority to speak to me. Satan, go away. You have no standing here, which I've said many times.
Every day.
And you see it go away and you go, okay, you know what? When he said the faith that moves mountains, I kind of almost taken my desires, right, that are like for achievement. And I basically said, let's see what happens today.
Mhm.
Let's see what happens today. You know, and that's the cool thing. It takes this pressure off of you to muscle something. And that's been my issue, Carter, for so long is I've been so capable of manipulating, or I've been so capable of, you know, pushing things around.
Me too.
And it's like, wow. So what you're saying is accomplishment and success isn't just what you accumulate, right? This is actually training for where Steve is. Right?
Uh,
This is, I mean,
and
we are
for here.
temporary. Yeah, we're temporary. But here's the cool thing. It's going to merge. He said it.
Yeah.
It
It's
will
not
become
separate.
one. It will become one. And
That's
I
right.
think a little bit of this, I feel like sometimes I've gotten to this idea that, well, I'm Jesus, right? I'm not Jesus. He's going to make these things one, but we're going to do it with him. And what's
Mhm.
interesting about it is, what if you don't see the kingdom come, the will be done on earth as it is in heaven in its fullness of what you think it is, but you see it in the moment with your own son, or you see it in the moment in that situation. And that's the thing that's really interesting because Steve said to me, he said, when Jesus was here, was the kingdom near? Yes, of course it was. Of course it was. And
Well,
so
where's
I
the
have this
kingdom?
idea of the whole redemption of the world and of the solar system, of the galaxy, and of the universe. And he's like, no, in this moment is the kingdom. And I'm like, so it's not only the big thing, but it's also the small thing. And that
That's
to me gives me such like, okay, so I can trust you with all of it.
You mentioned several things here, man. I'd like to share a story about death because death is one of those things I would talk with Steve a lot about. And man, he understood this topic. And it's interesting because Jesus is the one who used Stephen's death or his transcending from life to greater life.
Yes.
It was like one of the final teaching things, but not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my grandfather was my dad. I never had a dad. He was an alcoholic womanizer. And he chose, mom wouldn't let him around unless he was sober and didn't have one of his whores. And my grandpa was the greatest example of God to me. I sat in his lap. He read the cartoons. I learned to build. I learned to garden. I learned everything from him. And he passed away when I was 10. Created a lot of conflict with God. And so death is abandonment. and it feels like betrayal. And
Mhm.
even with God when I was younger, I didn't know that at the time.
Right. Right.
But so I have like this unnatural relationship with death. I know no one likes it, but I exceptionally don't like it because I'm like, you created life.
Right. Right.
We're not supposed to die. Well, I've struggled with that. And Steve and I talked about that topic probably 100 times, maybe more,
Mhm.
because in the last 2 years ago on Thanksgiving, my dad passed away. Exactly a year and a day later, my sister passed away. Right after the prodigal son story, my son walks in, or no, a week before that, someone does $25,000 worth of damage to the car. Right after the day after my sister passed away, my son, who's homeschooled, didn't have a clue, walks in and says, "Dad, I'm moving out with my girlfriend." Prodigal son story. Just so happened you and Steve had talked about the prodigal son just a week prior, and that was the biggest last hurdle that Steve helped me work through was my own son. And I understand now more his kingdom. And I blessed my son. I disagreed with his decision, but I gave him everything out of storage. I helped him move. It was a joy. Man, the Father loves it. And it's just part of the process. Hey, I needed to speed up Asher's training.
Yep.
I hated it. And then in Steve's death, I finally got it. We're just transcending from life to life. There is here and there is there. Steve would always say they're not separate, they're one.
Yeah, they're one.
Don't you know that your bodies are the temple of the living God? I will never leave you nor forsake you. Where is God?
Yeah.
Where is his temple?
Yeah.
It's already here, right? And then you mentioned like the rules, all the different episodes, the rest that we have is when we just listen to him and we can have that rest. But it was interesting. I wanted to share how you and I met.
Okay.
Because it kind of shows how God works. Tim had, my brother Tim had been watching you for a year.
All the crypto stuff. All the
crypto stuff. And he goes, dude, you got to talk to Matt about day 7. I said, I'm doing what Jesus wants me to do over here with Steve. I'm not talking to Matt. I didn't know who you were.
Yeah.
And he would I bet you he asked me to do that 100 times. And I'm not exaggerating. I learned one thing from Steve is don't bluster, don't exaggerate. But when you've been doing this a while, those numbers add up. The years add up. And but there was a time, and Jesus said yes. I still didn't know who you were. And he said yes. And then I'm like, well, what do I send him? Well, what did I send? This is why I said, I'm going to read it to you. Vision to build an infinitely expanding truth in the transaction digital universe. Mission to advance the transfer by providing superior products and services that restore privacy and control of data to the owner user in a digital marketplace. Purpose to be a communication link and extraction device that transfers the use and control of material wealth and resources to the kingdom of God on earth. I said, Jesus, I am not sending that because Steve and I work on that, and that means nothing to nobody. Nobody will understand that. There's got to be, and Tim's like, man, don't you have a brochure or some marketing stuff? And I said, Tim, I'm saying yes because Jesus said it's time for us to talk. And Jesus said to only send that. I don't like it either because it doesn't mean anything to anyone. But here's what happened, and I still have the clip on my computer. You read it on screen during Crypto Heartbeat, and you said, that's intriguing. That's interesting. That's where it started. You have always been interested. And this is the backstory. This is kind of the backstory. And then there was the event that you met Steve. Right? And I was going to come to that event. Tim said, you better go to the event. And God bless him. And I said, Steve, would you like to go to this event with this guy named Matt? My brother sent me over to him, and he's interested. See, that's the whole key word. Are you interested? Jesus will speak. And Steve always spent the evenings with his family. I think you probably know that. Most generally speaking, he goes, absolutely, I want to go. And I said, really? Because I was shocked. For 2 days, I wasn't going to ask him. But Jesus said, ask Steve if he wants to go to that meetup. And so finally I said, hey, Steve, I wasn't going to ask you because I know you spend all of your evenings with your family, but Jesus wanted me to ask you, do you want to go to this meeting? He goes, yep, let's go.
Wow.
It wasn't even a second, and I was in pure shock. And so that's the backstory to how Jesus works. No, no, no. But when it's time, he's interested. And I knew you were interested. Steve shows up, and the moment you always say, man, is that an angel? I was there. I got to witness it. It was amazing. And I'm like, I'm watching Jesus work in you.
Yeah.
And I just knew that Jesus said, hey, it is not time to talk about day 7. This is time for the preparing of the man. Shut your mouth. And but I wanted to share this. Jesus has shown me his kingdom in you. Every episode I've lived and I've watched, and I know where you're at, and I've learned something more. Every time I say, Jesus, how are you going to change the world? How are you going to do this with 8 billion people? It seems pretty hard. I've been at this for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. And then Steve would always say, it's accelerating. And then we got to celebrate every episode. When you guys were finished, I would call Steve, Matt's got it. Look at what Jesus is doing. Hey, Steve, Jesus is doing this all over the world. Look at what he's doing with Matt. And he's doing it way faster than he did it with me. And you learn so much faster than I did. And you got things that no one gets. Trust me, I've been trying to share this stuff with people forever. And if you do it with the religious people, you'll find out really quick. They'll slice your head off. Are you sure you're going to heaven? You need to check your salvation. You need that. Right? And you have been a joy to me, Matt. And I think what you have created here, and in honor of Steve, Jesus needed Steve to spend this time with you. Why? To create 42 episodes. To create more men and women of the transfer. For those who will hear and will show interest, Jesus will just swoop right in there. Just stay with it. And anyone that's listening, just keep asking him. If you're interested, he'll speak. If you're not, why would you speak?
Yeah.
You won't hear. But I have gotten to celebrate, and now we get to be on the show together, watching Jesus do the miraculous and prove to me, look, do you see my Elohim son, Matt? Do you see my Elohim son, David Lee? And I could list everyone on here because people, it's growing and it's eternal riches. He needed to take that time out, just like he took 7 years for me and he took 1.5 years with you. Now it's our turn to unite. Listen and participate with Jesus' plan. That's where we're all at now. Now is the time. And that's one of the things, Steve, and I don't know if he talked to you about it, but now this is a time. If you got to recognize that Kairos time, when linear time meets with Jesus' perfect strategic time, now is time for the sons and the daughters of God to act by participating with them, not doing one thing apart from him. Wow. Then you can't mess it up.
Right.
And so I just want to tell you, man, I celebrate you. I celebrate Jesus. I celebrate Steve. I miss our friend, man.
Yeah.
But you know what? I get to call you up. I get to call Stephen Root up. I get to call Joe Cotton up, and there's others, and he's uniting. And that's what Jesus told me when Steve passed is, hey, now unite them. Of course, I showed up at the memorial, and I'm like, got a notebook in my car. I'm like, I'm going to unite them all, right? Well, that wasn't the purpose.
Yep.
It still doesn't mean that he's not uniting. And the Spirit of God is in between us all. That's why we're all connected. We got to care for one another, hear what Jesus is saying in the midst. But man, it has been a joy to get off the phone and celebrate and watch, man, the stuff that you got, no one gets. I would like, Steve, Matt's getting it. Holy cow. How did he get that one? And then you would take it and Jesus would show you something else. And I'm like, hey, wait, I didn't get that part. Oh, now I understand that part because you and Steve talked about it. And I'm still watching them over and over. And I'm going back as Jesus leads, Matt, because this is how he works. It is about community. It's about unifying. It's about supporting and caring about one another.
Yep.
When we do it for each other, that is God doing it. Oh, Jesus, how do you give abundantly beyond measure, beyond what we can hope or ask? You know what he told me? When you do it for each other, because you are
Yeah.
You are the royalty. You are the ruler. You're the Elohim.
Well, you're an extension of him.
Yeah.
And you think about that, this idea of the Father and I are one, he said, right, many times.
That's
And you
right.
think about this idea of being a son and being made in an image and conformed to his likeness. As you know his nature and character, you end up looking like him.
Yeah.
And you think about that. C.S. Lewis talked about being little Christs. That was his term he would use in his writings. And that idea that we would be essentially the impression, right? You think about Jesus as the icon of God, right? This representation. If you've seen one, you've seen the other. And I think
Mhm.
that's really the big measure is if someone has seen you or seen me, have they seen Jesus? And
Yeah.
I realized, like, he's like, I don't give as the world gives. And that's the thing
Right.
that I've been like really understanding recently is the fact that Jesus doesn't judge the way we judge.
Mhm.
He doesn't judge based on balance sheets and P&Ls. He doesn't judge based on, bank accounts. Because if that were the case, Steve would have been wealthy in the world's eyes, but he was the wealthiest person I ever met, ever,
By far.
by far. And that's the thing. That's the upside down world, right? And so, being kind of called into this crypto space and all of these things, we're seeing this big transition. But I'll be honest with you, Carter, where I'm at right now, and I'm open to coaching, is that I think all of this is just what it was meant to be at the beginning, which is to make his name known so that we would rule and reign in his nature and character, that ultimately that's the transfer, that we would see his nature and character and understand the role that we play in it, and that is one of rest because he's out front, he's a shepherd, we recognize his voice, and he leads and we follow, and that in that is life.
Mhm.
Life isn't in the production, but we do produce. Life isn't in the creation, but we create. And so I just thank you so much, Carter, for being on this. I really, really appreciate you coming on. And you're one of the first with Steve, I think, as a long time learner. And to think that Steve's continuing to teach and Jesus is teaching us through that is dynamite. So I really appreciate you.
Man, I appreciate you, Matt. I wrote this down. I want to say this. Uh, Faith, when we speak, how important is it that we speak what Jesus speaks? Yeah, that's faith. When we speak what he speaks, it happens, right? We co-create with Jesus. When we speak what we call faith, our hopes and dreams, without asking him, we wonder why nothing happens. It's because he wasn't speaking it.
Yeah.
In order for us to have faith, we've got to first hear what Jesus speaks. Hey, Abraham, you're going to have a kid. Abraham had faith that God would perform what he said. Do you see how it works? And we kind of turn that around.
Yeah.
And I think there's people out there, for whatever reason, listen to Jesus. If you're interested, he'll speak and you can have faith in that.
Yeah.
And to Steve, man, Steve, what a man, dude. What a man. Jesus is the man. Steve was the man to me too.
Yeah.
He was, and I've said it before, but he was my best friend. He knew me, and he knew who you were because you were the most interesting person in the room.
Yep.
Steve was patient, and he understood, and he allowed Jesus to do the work. No, Carter, go ask Jesus. Just give me the answer, Steve. This time, we've been doing this for years. Can you
stop asking me so many questions?
No, and he would just say, otherwise it's marketing, it's putting lipstick on the pig until you have the experience, and you've got thousands that, 24 to 72 hours?
Yeah.
Dude, I remember the first time you mentioned it, and I called Steve. I'm like, oh, dude, he's having it too. 12 or, 24 to 72 hours, Jesus would speak and take you into that experience. Let me ask you a question, Matt. Did you understand it after the experience far greater than before? It was words.
Yeah. There's no question. It's the evidence of its truthfulness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing in this world that makes me more happy than that.
Well, and what's crazy is, we think in terms of blind faith, And I think what's so great is when you think about this idea of, you know, you see things from his perspective and the words that are there. And Steve said it, and I even looked it up, and we talked about it a couple episodes ago. Is that what comes with it is faith? Because when he speaks something, you can take it to the bank. It happens. The things that we speak, our perspective isn't his perspective, and so when we gain his perspective, it carries with us this faith to endure, or to accomplish, or to continue. And that's the big aha. That was my final lesson with Steve, was episode 37, and that has continued to be the case. But it's you know, it's funny because, I think you and I have some similarity in that I think we're particularly impatient at times. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting because I know some people that I would consider to be patient like Steve, and it's like, what it is, and if we are doing it with him, and without him we can do nothing.
Right.
This is pretty clear to me. Let's walk with you. Let's do this, and you're not in a rush. You got this all figured out. You got this. And I'm like, okay, I've got that. You've got this. So, and he makes a way where there is no way. And he's just like, all right. So
Well, it takes us deeper into that experience so that that is the place of rest.
yeah, it is.
Man.
Well, yeah, it's truth. It's true. And it's the way, right? And it's the life. Like, that's what it is. And it's very practical and it's real. Because here's the thing, I would not represent something, Carter, that wasn't true. I
Me neither.
can't play games. I'm
Me
not
neither.
not interested in playing games. And to me, it was hokey until, it was hokey stuff. And
It is okay.
The Lord showed me that it is real, and it is real power. And it's how things, you're aligning yourself with the very nature of the structure and order of creation. And it's very practical. And I think we're tempted to add things to it, like flourishes, and there's no need for it.
No.
It has plenty of it in itself. But we're gonna wrap up, dude.
Truth stands on its own, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
Thank you
Carter
so much,
Hill,
Matt.
thank you so much for joining. What a blessing this has been. Episode 42 in the books. And boy, way more than I expected, as every episode has been. So thank you, Carter.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jesus.
There you go. God bless you, man. See ya.
God bless you, brother.
All right. Wow. I feel like that's my reaction to every one of these episodes, is like, wow. And once again, God sees you at the corner of his eye. Isn't it amazing? I mean, imagine you, right? Just take yourself. I think about this myself. Like, when you're done, right? When you're called home, when it's over for you, what will people say about you? What will they say about you? And I think about that a lot, right? Because Steve, it was funny. He was having a heart attack, and the family said, yeah, he even joked with the surgeon. They were going to put a stent in, right? Which seems like really practical. Like, oh, yeah, this happens all the time. My dad had 2 stents, And Steve said, hey, you any good at this? Which I love, right? That's so Steve, right? Not worked up, didn't have a panic button. Okay, yeah, well, all right, Jesus, are we done? What do we got here? Is this, unto death? What is this? And, here we are. Here we are talking about, Carter comes in and it's like, oh man, it's like a father to me. He was a best friend. He was all these things, honoring each other. There's an interesting merger here, right? We often think of Jesus as separate guy walking in sandals in the first century. And what we don't realize is that he's alive and he speaks and he's right here with us, right? Like, it's not, there's no separation. And that, Carter said it well, right? You're the temple of the Holy Spirit. Like, inside of you is this living God. And you go, well, what's the evidence of that? Well, the fruit. What are you drawing upon? And to think that every word that comes out of the mouth of God, like, it's very, very difficult for us to have any value or provide any value if we're not drawing from the actual source. And this to me is it's something worth talking about for the rest of my life, right? And I thank Steve for that. It's a purpose and a cause, because it's so simple, it's so beautiful, it's so congruent, it's so relevant, it's so powerful, and it's so true. And I often heard this as a kid. You're like, hey, it's the good news, right? You've heard that many times, right? The gospel is good news. And I remember somebody saying, is it really good news? Is the gospel good news for the Mormon? Is it good news for the Scientologist? Is it good news for, the Buddhist? Is it good news for, just insert whatever you want to insert? And the answer is yes. Because if you think about this, we use that term Jesus and it's so loaded, right? The name of Jesus, because in our culture, it's so loaded with such power, right? I mean, divided time, there's all kinds of implications there. But if you think about this, what are we saying? Well, in this context, the Yahweh of the Elohim, the boss, God's son, Jehovah's son, the son who all things were created for him and by him, is available, is living. We're about to come up on Easter. Easter's coming soon. And of course, in Christendom, we often pause and we say, He is risen. My son and I talking about Maundy Thursday, right? This day of the Last Supper, this commandment, this new covenant, and then, going to the cross and Good Friday, and then, literally into the depths of the earth, and then the resurrection. And like, He is risen. If you're somebody that can confidently say He is risen, then He's alive. And if He spoke this thing into existence, He's still speaking today. Question is, are we listening? And if His purpose for creating us is that we would rule and reign with Him in His nature and character, then let's ask Him, right? And that's the one thing Steve said to me, and that's the legacy of Steve. Ask Him yourself, Matt. Leading someone directly to the feet of Jesus and, the creator of heavens and the earth. And I think what is happening, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. What I think is happening is these things are going to be exposed. And all this stuff you hear about, the disclosure and all that's all going to point back to Him. And that's the thing. What does it say in the scriptures? Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. We'll see it for what it is. And that just goes to show you that it's all being exposed. And Steve said, don't add any energy to it. Let it be. Let it be. Let it be. Jesus is out front. He's strategic. He knows what's happening. Nothing is a surprise to Him. Do you got it that He's got it? I'm like, yeah, I got it. So rest in Him and enjoy what He's doing. Because I think about all of those that are in crypto, because this, ultimately is a crypto channel, at least the other days of the week. And what is this crypto thing all about? Why would God be changing the entire financial system? It talks about in Revelation 19 about Babylon burning in an hour. And they're like, man, we used to trade and sell goods and do all these things, and now it's gone. And they stand off and they watch it burn. Well, what is this? What are we seeing? This system, this economic system that is literally extractive in nature is burning. And it's going to collapse on itself. And that in His wisdom, He would show that there is a provision in the midst of that. And what is it? It's more freedom. And so what is the evil side doing? But trying to lock it down, right? Trying to literally lock it down. And when you see that, Tucker Carlson said the other day, he said, you know what? This isn't left or right or Democrat, Republican. He's like, there's kind of two types of people in this world. The people that know, the people that think they are God, right? This transhumanist type, that they are God or gods, and those who know they're not. And I think once you realize that difference, right? And I don't mean in Elohim sense of that we are called to be, but we're doing it with Him, is that it's like those who think they're God and those who know they're not is like a great delineation. But to think that, you're more than conquerors with Him is incredible. So another episode in the books, I hope is a blessing to you as it was to me. And we will move forward, but enjoy your weekend and do not mess with Texas. Take care, everybody.